Sidetrack episode 50. What a revelation! Welcome back to A2Z History Presents The History of the Papacy. The History of the Papacy podcast is a proud member of the Agora podcast network. We're a group of independent podcasters. Our goal is to create thought-provoking and high-quality audio entertainment, also known as podcasts. The Agora Podcast Network show of the month is Reconsider by Eric and Xander. Reconsider gives you the context and information about current events so that you have the tools to make your own conclusions on hot-button issues. This is not the usual politics podcast, so definitely check it out. Learn more at agorapodcastnetwork.com. If you've ever thought of supporting the show, Patreon is a great way to do it. Thank you today to our Constantinople-level patrons Regan, Sandy, Andy, Paul, and Dr. Jeff, as well as our Alexandria-level patron Chris. I've included a link in the show notes to my Amazon wish list. When you're checking out your items at Amazon and your cart just might be a little bit light, think about adding one of these items to your cart. It's very greatly appreciated and really helps with doing research and that sort of thing for the show. With all that out of the way, this is the 6th installment of Garry and Steve's Guide to the Apocalypse. In this episode, Garry and I give an overview of the book of Revelation. The Apocalypse of St. John, or Revelation, is the only piece of apocalyptic literature to make it into the canonical New Testament. We'll discuss the historical background of this book, its writer, and how it's organized. It should be a lot of fun. Thank you very much for listening, and enjoy the apocalypse. It is nigh after all. Welcome back to our next part of our Garry and Steve's Guide to the Apocalypse. Today we are talking about the book of Revelation, the major Christian apocalypse, and the one apocalypse that made it into the official biblical canon of nearly every Christian group. I guess you could say every Christian group has Revelation in its canon, well, except for one. And we might as well talk about that now. Every single group except for the Assyrian Church of the East includes the book of Revelation in their official canon. The Catholics, Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, Anglicans, and just about every Protestant group has Revelation in its official Bible.
And the Ethiopians have it.
The Ethiopians have it as well. And today we're going to talk about Revelation and how it's organized and how it's interpreted, which that can be very interesting indeed. And also how it came about and where it came from, because that's a story in and of itself. So Garry, how you doing today?
I'm doing fine, Steve. And yourself?
I'm great. And I'm really glad to get together again to do this apocalypse talk. It's coming sooner or later. We're getting to the apocalypse here.
Yes.
Lots of apocalypses.
Lots of apocalypses. Who knows what will happen after the elections? There's always an apocalypse around the corner.
And this apocalypse is called the Apocalypse Revelation, is also called the Revelation of St. John, or it has several different names, but it was written by a John, and traditionally that John is associated with John the Apostle, one of Jesus's initial followers. And the revelations, as we learn through talking about the apocalypse of Adam and Daniel, it's when someone is getting a direct message from God about what's happening, either what's happened already or what's going to happen in the future. It's a direct connection and somebody seeing what's going to happen in the end. It's an eschatological book. Now, the story of John starts with Jesus. We'll back it up to there. And John could have been the author of the book of John, which is a canonical gospel, as well as the letters of John that are also canonical in the New Testament scripture. But there is some debate about that because, Garry, isn't everything debatable when you're talking about the Bible?
Everything is completely debatable. One thing that struck me is that the earlier the texts in Christianity, the more likely they are to be anonymous. And scholars have to try and figure out, well, who actually wrote these? It's sort of the later texts that start saying, yes, my name is Petrinus, and this is my gospel. But hardly any of those actually made it into the canonical New Testament. So the early ones, well, like the four Gospels, they are anonymous. None of them declare their authorship. It's only starting with, I think, the Gospel of John mentions John. Yeah, so that's an interesting thing.
And that's really where we get into John big time. In the beginning of the book of Revelation, it says that this was written by John on Patmos, which is an island off of the coast of Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. And there's a couple of different dates. The generally accepted date that the book was written is in the mid-90s AD. But a lot of scholars think that the original ideology or creation of the idea, the revelation, if you will, happened in the 60s AD. And there's a lot to back that up that we will get into. But the book wasn't actually written down onto parchment or papyrus or however they wrote it down about 20 to 30 years later by a John, and it might not have actually been the same John. And this is something that we've talked about in the past about authorship, and that if somebody wrote in the school or the same way that another author wrote, that they would give the authorship. It's kind of like Stephen King. If Stephen King was dead and somebody continued to write Stephen King-like novels, they wouldn't say, well, this is a book inspired by Stephen King. They would have just said it was by Stephen King, especially if it was maybe one of Stephen King's close editors who was carrying on. It's actually an author who that happens with a lot is Dr. Seuss.
Oh.
There's a lot of books that they're licensed and they put like the Dr. Seuss logo on there, but they're by somebody else.
Oh, really?
And they're generally not as clever as his books.
Right. Okay.
And I think that's maybe what happened with John, that the original John had some great ideas, but they wound up in an editor's hands who maybe wasn't quite as clever or didn't have quite as clear of a vision as John did.
Yes, I mean, your book's going to sell a lot better if it's associated with someone famous from the past, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that that's a lot of ways for people to say, oh, well, just discount the book. It doesn't count if John didn't actually write it down himself. But what was actually writing back then? Did John have a first draft that he passed on to this other guy who maybe added 10%? Is it not John's anymore? I think that kind of evolution is something that we really can't account for anymore.
That's true. I mean, it could have been that the Apostle John did write something, say, in the 60s, the core of the book. And then, there may have been a school of people, the Johannine school, I think they're called, who evolved it over the decades, like the school of Aristotle or Plato or something.
Or even think about it like modern day politicians. They crank out a book that was ghost written and they don't even give the ghostwriter credit.
Yeah. Or royalties.
Yeah. But I think it's what authorship means exactly is kind of a fuzzy thing. And it's much fuzzier back then.
Oh, yeah, much fuzzier. I mean, from what I gather, it was a well-established convention in the classical world, certainly, that you could adopt someone else's name as was almost taken for granted.
Yeah, and I think that's where a lot of the early Christians had a hard time deciding if a book was by Paul or if it was Pauline.
Yeah.
And they had a serious issue then of sorting that out.
Yeah, that's true. It's sort of like some of those Renaissance painters who founded schools, isn't it? Is it a real Caravaggio or is it by one of his school? Does it matter that much?
Yeah, that's a big thing in the art world, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely if the artist had his vision and he passed it on to disciples who painted in his style, who he trained.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think the sculpture Rodin, I think this story is true. You know, like the famous sculpture, The Thinker.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently Rodin only ever made miniatures. And then he passed it on to his colleagues. And they actually made the full-size version. He didn't.
So he was the idea man and they were the craftsmen.
Yeah, exactly. He was the idea man. He said, okay, make a big one that looks just like this. And they did.
Yeah, that opens up a Pandora's box of what's when people are collaborating. I don't know if that's a Western mindset that one person has to do something and their name gets put on it and that's the person who did it. And anything that isn't is inauthentic.
Yeah. Does seem like a very Western thing, doesn't it?
Not that I know how the Chinese do it or anything, but I think it seems Western.
Mm. Particularly in sort of big amorphous and complex works like movies or something. If the original director sort of leaves halfway through and some other director takes over, which seems to be pretty common from what I can gather, is it the original director's work? Is it following his vision? So I suppose it'd be the same with these manuscripts.
And so and it's probably confusing that maybe that editor was John of Patmos. Mm. That's where one of the controversies comes up is that Patmos is it's a small island right off the coast of Asia Minor. I believe it's within seeing distance of the mainland.
Oh, okay.
It's maybe 20 miles. I don't know. Don't quote me on that.
Yep.
But that doesn't really matter. It's close. Yeah. And there's a whole bunch of islands that are really close. And it's very close to the city of Ephesus, which was gigantically important for early Christianity.
Oh, yes.
And that's traditionally where John the Apostle is said to have died and lived most of his life post Jesus times was in Ephesus.
Okay.
One of the common stories is that Patmos was almost like a prison colony of the Romans where people were kept for indeterminate amount of time, sort of like a Devil's Island or not for nothing, Australia of the Roman Empire.
Yeah. Small version of Australia.
But that might not necessarily be true. It is possible that during a localized persecution or a time where they wanted to separate a troublemaker like John, they may have just shoved him off to Patmos to keep him away from his followers.
Okay, so there'll be like the Roman convention of exiling people to some dumpy little island somewhere.
Because the archaeology that I've looked at doesn't back up that it was a penal colony. There was a big town on Patmos that was a trading center. It had agriculture. It doesn't fit what you would maybe generally think as a penal colony or as a prison island. And not that that kind of changes the whole idea. And that's where I think when I initially read it, I read through it 2 times, Revelation, and it made zero sense to me.
Yeah. Yes.
Absolutely no sense.
You should try First Enoch. That's 100 chapters.
Well, and that's where Revelation comes in, is that it's so chocked full of Old Testament references. Basically, every line is a reference to something in the Old Testament, making it probably the most Jewish book of the whole New Testament canon. Yeah,
you'll find huge chunks of stuff which has obviously been inspired by the wackiness in Ezekiel and Daniel scattered throughout the whole book. If you removed all those references and that material, you'd probably only have 4 out of the 22 chapters left.
I was really shocked digging more into this. I think all those books, like there's books of Ezekiel that you can't even read in a family podcast.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the shocking part. Isn't there something, there was a proverb with rabbis that you shouldn't even study Ezekiel until you're 30 years old?
That's right. Yes, I think the first 2 chapters of Ezekiel, you're not meant to touch until you're already a master rabbi and you know your way around the whole Old Testament. It was held to be sort of dangerous, subversive, or crazy.
I think that's what a lot of those books like Enoch and Ezekiel and Daniel, they're like playing with fire. And that's what Revelation really turns into, is that if when people start interpreting it outside of its context, it just all goes downhill very quickly.
I'd agree with that. I mean, Revelation has a centuries-long tradition of being interpreted by the people of whatever time who are reading it as pertaining to their times, making some sorts of prediction about the imminent end of the world, when in fact you really do have to look at it as a product of a certain community who seem to have had the codings or the secret knowledge to be able to interpret it.
The initial part of the book is John has a revelation, or he's visited by Jesus, who asks him to write letters to the 7 churches of Asia Minor, which are...
the 7 churches are Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea, which is Sparta, I think.
And those are gigantic, important cities, except for Thyatira. I had never heard of that one, but Pergamum was a gigantic, important city.
Yeah, that was
Sardis, Ephesus, Laodicea. All of them were really important cities, but it's kind of interesting that the cities that they didn't mention, like Chalcedon doesn't get mentioned, and that was a city, or Nicaea, or Ancyra, which were also important cities at the time. It's kind of interesting that those that there were some cities that were left out, that they're pretty specific geographically. They're all very close to each other in Asia Minor.
Yeah, actually, I might just give a quote from one of the letters to, say, Ephesus, just to give you a bit of a taste of the book. This is Revelations 2:1, and he writes, "To the angel of the church in Ephesus write, these are the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, who walks among the 7 golden lampstands. I know your works, your toil, and your patient endurance, but I have this against you, that you have abandoned the love that you had at first. Remember then from what you have fallen, repent, and do the works you did at first. If not, I will come to you and remove your lampstand from its place, unless you repent." So that's a typical paragraph about the church. He's talking to them. He says, love your work, guys, but there's a few little problems here. And he's also throwing in this image of a golden lampstand and walking amongst the 7 golden lampstands. And that's a classic Revelation thing. And I think, the casual reader, you're reading it, and it's obvious he's writing, a letter to the congregation in Ephesus, but what on earth are the golden lampstands? The answer is we don't know.
And that's a great place to dive into the context, that a lot of the things that we'll be talking about is we're trying to maybe pull together a lot of different theories that are going on around there. There's almost an infinite amount of theories on the context and the interpretation of this book. But one thing is that this is a very Jewish book, and it was directed to the Jewish congregations of Asia Minor in a very specific context.
Yeah, I think it's really worth emphasizing just how Jewish it is. The whole book is well in the long tradition by then of Jewish apocalyptic and cryptic works. There's nothing which really distinguishes it from them. There are references to Jesus, but they're really pretty pretty vague. There's only one reference, I think, in the whole book to the historic Jesus, the guy who came down and lived on earth. All the other references are to these various heavenly or celestial figures, which fit right in with other celestial figures from the Jewish literature. I mean, if you just eliminated the name Jesus or the Lord, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference, really, to a normal Jewish apocalyptic work.
And I think it's interesting to hear exactly how John describes Jesus in the first chapter in verse 12, where he says, quote, "I turned around to see a voice that was speaking to me. And when I turned, I saw the 7 golden lampstands, and among the lampstands was someone like a son of man, dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet, and with golden sash around his chest. The hair on his head was white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and coming out of his mouth was a sharp double-edged sword. His face was like the sun shining in all its brilliance." That does not sound like the 4 canonical Gospels, Jesus.
No, not at all. In fact, it sounds a lot like Daniel. May I quote Daniel? Daniel 7:9. "As I looked on, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His garment was like white snow, and the hair of his head was like lamb's wool." Now let's leap to Daniel 10:5. "I looked and saw a man dressed in linen, his loins girt in fine gold. His body was like beryl, his face had the appearance of lightning, his eyes were like flaming torches, his arms and legs had the colour of burnished bronze." It's straight out of Daniel.
Yeah. And it's really trying to make that connection to the Old Testament and to the Old Covenant books. That's an Old Testament description. That's refocusing Jesus completely as an Old Testament God. And that's really the first step a lot believe in of really the birth of the Trinity, is making Jesus as God in there.
Yes, I think one thing to mention, the phrase the Son of Man. Son of Man seems to have been a standard Hebrew term which simply meant human being, person. It has no connotations of divinity. In fact, it's the exact opposite.
Yeah, when he's taking on this the Son of Man, it's almost like they're taking that vocabulary that everyone was comfortable with and they're reimagining it or refocusing it.
Yeah, investing in it with a wholly new significance.
That's what I think that is really interesting, is that the whole book, feeling that it was written for a Jewish audience who was really steeped in all of this language. They would have known Ezekiel, they would have known Daniel, they would have known Hosea, they would have known all those things inside and out. And this person is writing almost in a code to them.
Yes, and it assumes the audience is at least vaguely familiar with the code. But I think if you had been, say, a Gentile Christian, a Roman Christian, you'd have had no idea what he was talking about.
Yeah, I think that that's what the book is really trying to do, essentially, is to convince Jews that this new idea of Judaism is the real way to go. To me, that's what this book is trying to do, is that they're writing to the Jews of Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea, that this new idea of Judaism is the one that you should be getting on board on.
Yes, because it has so much in common with what you already know, would be the message, I suppose.
And that kind of makes sense if John is pulling these ideas together in the 60s, the late 60s, 70s. Remember that the larger context was that the Jewish wars was going on in the Middle East, in the area around Syria and Palestine, that if you live there, you would probably think the end of the world was coming 4 or 5 Roman legions are going into towns and killing everyone and destroying the towns.
Yeah.
And then ultimately in 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed, completely razed to the ground, if you were a Jewish person living there, that's the end of the world.
Yeah, that is the end of the world. The ancient temple, the seat of God's presence, is gone. It'd be literally the end of the world. Well, not literally. Okay, all right.
You probably think it was coming.
You probably think it was coming. You probably think that this truly was the end of times.
There's that spiritual element and that idea that the world was coming to the end when the temple was destroyed. But then there's also there's a lot of ideas out there that this was talking about persecution of early Christians. But to me, it almost sounds like if you were thinking there was towns in Syria like Tyre, where all the Jews were taken from the town and slaughtered. That's persecution. And the Romans probably weren't asking questions. Well, are you a Second Temple follower who thinks Jesus is the Messiah, but he's not divine? Oh, you're one who thinks that Jesus is divine and the Messiah. I don't think that centurion was coming in and asking those questions.
No, he wouldn't be going through the theological fine points, would he now? They just pull out his sword.
And then a whole town is wiped out. That's the mindset to put this book into. And it's interesting when we get into more detail, the numerology, or this book is just chocked full of using numbers to mean things.
Yeah, the number 7 pops up quite a lot. 7 days in the week, there were 7 known planets, 7 angels.
7 lampstands.
7 lampstands.
7 stars.
7 stars, there's the 7 trumpets.
And then the number 12 and multiples of 12 come up a lot.
Yeah, 7 and 12 were the Israelites' favorite Powerball picks, I think.
They talk a lot about numbers, and then they talk a lot about another number that comes up big time is the number 1000 and the millennium.
That's true. There's 1,000 years, and of course there's 144,000 people who are going to be saved. I always wondered where the Jehovah's Witnesses got that from.
That's an interesting one. One of the commentators that I read, a modern commentator, said that he met a Jehovah's Witness, and this guy was a full Jehovah's Witness, and he said the 12,000 or the 144,000 is completely filled up already.
All right.
Of the actual saved. And that's, I think to me, that's where when you start getting into this as a literal interpretation, what's 144,000? That's a neighborhood in people's, in most major metropolises around the world. That's not a lot of people.
No, that's not a lot of people.
But if you rewind to the 60s AD, a number like 144,000 is almost an unimaginable number.
That's true. It would have been a decent city, wouldn't it?
Yeah. And just the number 1,000 was actually shorthand for a lot.
Yeah.
You got 1,000 of something, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Nobody had 1,000 sheep. A government would probably have like 1,000 talents of gold.
Yeah.
Or 1,000 numista, or your average person did not have that kind of money. 1,000 of something was a lot of something.
That's true. The only things you'd be counting in thousands would be grains of sand.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you certainly wouldn't have 1,000 sheep. You wouldn't have 1,000 houses. You wouldn't have 1,000 servants.
And 1,000 starting to get outside of what a person can actually comprehend.
Yeah. I suppose it'd be something like the word billion today.
Yeah. It's really shorthand for a big number. And that's what a lot of these things in Revelation are. It's shorthand, or it's just layer upon layer of figurative language. That's what I found in trying to read all this, and what could you take as an analogy today to try and tie it back to. And I think that's what really starts to make interpretation of this book so difficult. There's really nothing to get a handhold of.
Yeah. Do you want to bring in the crossword puzzle analogy now? I thought that was really good.
Oh, you know what? That was I actually did think of one analogy as I know the New York Times crossword puzzle is probably the one that's most popular in the U.S., but I think maybe the Times of London is one that has a crossword puzzle.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And when you pick that up, if you're not used to that, you probably won't get one clue right, because it's so much of knowing what the language of the clues are and the way they ask the questions. Like my father-in-law, actually, he can do the whole thing in a couple of minutes because he's done them so long. He knows why they say certain things certain ways.
Yeah, apparently it's sort of a giant secret club, and you have to read the clues. I must admit, I've taken a look at some of these cryptic crossword puzzles and the subsequent answers, and I'm thinking, what? How did you get that? It's a vast coded system, and as you say, if you know the tricks, if you know the coding, it seems to be almost obvious. But to the rest of us, it's just what?
And then imagine trying to use that to interpret how to live your life.
Oh, yeah, you're right. That's a good analogy. Yes, yeah. Today's crossword puzzle predicts tomorrow's future, and this is what I shall do to prepare for it. Okay.
So we've come to the conclusion you can possibly live your life by interpreting crossword puzzles. Maybe I would have made some better life choices if I had. Next time, we'll get into the schools of interpretation and the theology of the book of Revelation.
So join us next time for that great, mysterious book.